Hey everybody, welcome back. We are continuing on with Simone Weil's The Iliad, or the Poem of Force. Um, we're going to try to get through some of the remaining, um, what I take to be important passages that give us, a really good sense of what she's trying to get at with this essay. Um, I wanted to just sort of, remind you that um, her her basic definition, or perhaps even thesis, is something like force in all the various ways that we might encounter it. An expression of power or violence or domination renders not only the victim, but also the actor, the enactor, the perpetuator, the doer, um, as things. It turns people into things, and it's an assault on the soul of people, of the individual. Um, and whether or not this was clear, in that first video, there is a striking similarity, I think, to Nietzsche's conception of the world as will to power. The difference here, however, is that you know they, while not trying to offer some sort of easy solution and like somehow we can fix it and make everything okay. And in that way, she is, at least where she's at in her thinking here in this piece. She is she's a tragic philosopher, and I know that depending on where you're at and how you associate with that term, you might think, oh, she's an unfortunate philosopher, a sad philosopher. Um, no, I mean maybe, but that she understands the world in terms of as a tragic situation in which force plays an essential feature. It's something that has happened since the beginning, and it's always happened, is happening, and there doesn't seem to be any reason that it would be ending anytime soon. Um, and so, she's articulating it here as force. And we have these ancient accounts like the Iliad, which is perhaps the best and purest, most sublime version of it. And she's, as I mentioned last time, she sort of gives us a few examples of other works that seem to touch upon it to varying degrees of success or fidelity. Um, but that this understanding of the world and of the human situation seems to bear some striking similarity to Nietzsche's notion of will to power. But the difference is, as I was saying earlier, while she doesn't offer a solution as such, she is offering some possibility of a way to temporarily negate its spiritual effects, perhaps, or its on the rare occasions that it can happen, our ability on either in either sort of point of the spectrum, or as either sort of um, prime or clear factor in this equation. She's offering the possibility that we can somehow, through this cultivation of virtue, again, something that Nietzsche was very critical of, because he was trying to bring back pre-Socratic notions of virtue. Perhaps more sophistic Thrasymachine notions of virtue that see strength, that see power as virtues that have been rendered um, have been rendered that have been neutered by philosophy and by religion, Christianity. And so he's trying to go back behind the discipline of philosophy to recover something Homeric about it. And we don't quite see that with Vey. With Vey, she sees quite, I think, the opposite, that in fact, certain philosophies um, give us the possibility of relief in a sense. Why did the Stoics come to the view that the Stoics did, or what's contained in the Gospels, or what moments, whatever brief moments, do we find in the Iliad itself that show us that there's perhaps a way forward, a way to sort of deal with, have a fighting chance, so to speak, of dealing with the world force. So, saying all that, just to recap a bit and explicate a little bit more. Let's go ahead and pick up where we left off. On page 167, if you drop down to that longer paragraph, and this is, I think that we talked about this with the scene with Achilles and Priam coming and begging for Hector's body so that he could properly bury him. And the sort of powerful interaction that he has, this powerful emotional interaction that he has. He says, and I'm going back a little bit over what we read last time, both were remembering, thinking of Hector, killer of men, Priam wept, abased at the feet of Achilles. But Achilles wept now for his father, now for Patroclus, and their sobs resounded through the house. It was not, this is her writing, it was not insensibility that made Achilles, with a single movement of his hand, push away the old man who had been clinging to his knees. Priam's words, recalling his own old father, had moved him to tears. It was merely a question of his being as free in his attitudes and movements, as if, clasping his knees, there were not a suppliant, but an inert object. Anybody who is in our vicinity exercises a certain power over us by his very presence, and a power that belongs to him alone, that is, the power of halting, repressing, modifying each movement that our body sketches out. I want to go over that again just because, it's reminiscent of another, well-known, I think, philosopher of the 20th century, Emmanuel Levinas. And Levinas does a lot of work with thinking about the other and our ethical, responsibility for the other, and it's the face of the other that is, present before us. That just by being there places a demand upon us. And I'm not necessarily saying that Weil is giving us exactly the same thing here, but she is picking up on the fact that people just being present before us make demands upon us, make us have to deal with them, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean in a negative sense. This could be something that's very very positive, very ethical, and I think that's kind of the point. Is that it does make it to where we have to decide if we're going to treat them like people, or we're going to treat them like things. Are we going to treat them like objects that just sort of have to be moved aside, or they have to be manipulated, or are these people that somehow are going to elicit something better from us, or at least more genuine? Are we going to be intentional or virtuous in those interactions with others? And it's really easy in this life, filled with so many people that we don't know, that seem to just be interruptions or distractions in this life. And I think that we have a moment here with Achilles and Priam in which, Achilles has to sort of process the same thing. And what Priam is dealing with is something that elicits an emotional response from him to go back and think about his own relationship to his father, and perhaps what he would want, right, in a similar circumstance. And of course, this is going to move him to pity, right? It's going to move him to act in a perhaps more noble way, or a modification, or just a different expression of a nobility that he perhaps possesses. So saying that, let's go to page 168. And there's the quotation there near the top. He says, he spoke, the old man trembled and obeyed, right? So, and then she writes, at least a suppliant, At least a suppliant, once his prayer is answered, becomes a human being again, like everybody else. But there are other, more unfortunate creatures who have become things for the rest of their lives. Their days hold no pastimes, she writes, no free spaces, no room in them for any impulse of their own. And of course, what she's getting at here is like there's slaves, or there's people that basically function as slave in some sort of like power dynamic or some sort of relationship, and they're really just they're not free. Um, and these are perhaps the people that are most expressly and regularly the victims of force, right? Like we all are, but they're the ones that it's most conspicuous with them. It's most obvious with them. They're not free in their responses. They can't just they're not free to respond, again, positively or negatively, right? But especially given the conversation that we're having, especially in a positive sense, that is not something that they have access to. And then we drop down a few lines. Says this thing is constantly aspiring to be a man or a woman and never achieving it. Here, surely is death, but death sprung out over a whole lifetime. Here surely is life, but life that death congeals before abolishing. Something like, these people are basically, in a sense, they've already become a corpse, right? This is them becoming a thing. It's not as though they're alive, everything's fine. They got some challenges like everyone else, and then one day they die. That really that their death and their life are, she says here, it's congealing. They're sort of mixed together, and it's basically just like a really long, protracted death. And obviously, from a certain tragic philosophical or from the position of just mortality, yes, we're going to die, and that's a reality that we have to sort of own up to. But what she's getting at here is that the tools at one's disposal, the inner resources at one's disposal, that if the soul has been assaulted in such a way that and one is deprived of those tools and resources, they can't they can't um, they can't deal in every situation as perhaps other people who are more free to do so, if they're more free to do so. That they're basically it's one long slow death, right? And if we jump over to page 169, that last paragraph, she writes, since the slave has no license to express anything except what is pleasing to his master. This is a really, really powerful point she's about to make here. It follows that the only emotion that can touch or eat and live in him a little, that can reach him in the desolation of his life, is the emotion of love for his master. There's no place else to send the gift of love. All other outlets are barred, just as with a horse and a harness bit, shafts, reins bar every way but one. And so this is really a terrible point, but an interesting and insightful, perhaps psychological point, that when all types of responses are controlled, that the slave, or again, one that is basically um, is functioning as a slave, that there's only one sort of way to respond. I'll put it the way. Let's see how she does it. That follows that the only emotion that can touch or live in him a little bit, right, in that desolated place, is love. But what can they love? Because they're not allowed to love. They're not allowed to live a life in which they are freely electing into different loving relationships, or even profound emotional attachments to particular activities, or institutional affiliations, right? Whatever, it could be like church or something like that, whatever it is, higher education, whatever. But these are all controlled, and so where can the love go? Only where it's allowed to go. And where is it but the very one who is like controlling them, right? And that this is so strange, right? But also so necessary because it's the only way to respond. She's arguing, in which there's a sort of hope of a way forward. She goes on to say, um, and if by some miracle in the slave's breast a hope is born, the hope of becoming someday through somebody's influence, someone once again, becoming a person again, how far won't these captives go to show love and thankfulness, even though these emotions are addressed to the very men who should, considering the very recent past, still reek with horror? And then she goes a long sort of passage to demonstrate what she's talking about. And then on page 170, she says, to lose more than the slave does is impossible, for he loses his whole inner life. Um, that the one thing that they really need is the sort of miraculous moment in which love can sort of spontaneously generate. And it's denied for them except for this near impossible, object of love. What are we to do with this? I mean, I'll leave it for you to consider and to think about. I know that it's going to strike a lot of us as absurd and wrong. Um, but I think that Bay's dealing with the historic reality of the world, and going back to the ancient world or in more recent times, um, you know what is the way to reclaim an inner life for oneself, founded in something that is good, something that is life affirming, that allows for a just a way to live life, that isn't rendered meaningless and thingly. And she sees it in this. One of the ways that she sees it is that the possibility of love can still exist, even if it's loving your enemy, even if it's something that profoundly difficult and seemingly impossible. She goes on to say, force, this is again on page 170, in the hands of another exercises over the soul the same tyranny that extreme hunger does, for it possesses and in perpetuo the power of life and death. Its rule over is as cold and hard as the rule of inert matter. The man who knows himself weaker than another is more alone in the heart of a city than a man lost in the desert. I'm going to fold that over into this next point on page 171. Force is as pitiless to the man who possesses it or thinks he does as to its victims, which is that point we've made a couple of times. The second, it crushes the first. The second, the victims, it crushes. The first, it intoxicates, right? So force is doing to the soul. I mean, it does it to the body as well, right? But we're kind of focusing on the sort of spiritual and psychological impact of it. It does to the soul what hunger does to the body, right? It weakens it, it diminishes it, eventually it kills it. And here she's saying that force is pitiless to the person that it possesses or thinks that they possess it, as to the victims. It's intoxicating to exercise control and power over other people. She's saying. I mean, this is think about. I've asked you to do this in the past. Think about the games you play, the movies you like. Um, think about how you sort of imagine certain scenarios in which things go your way. All sort of varying degrees of a sort of drama that's orchestrated in which you get to be the sort of hero in a in this life drama, and in which people through because of your skill, your savvy, how interesting and how cool or whatever you are, right? That this is a way in which you get to sort of exercise perhaps force over people. Not maybe not the overt stuff. That's just the exaggerated stuff of the revenge plot in the movie or whatever it is, but in your own way, and it's an intoxicating feeling. Well, I mean, why would it not be? You're getting to exercise your full array of human powers, or at least some aspects of them, and so that people see you the way that you want them to see you, and they respond to you the way that you want them to respond to you. but that these also have victims. Again, to varying degrees of conspicuousness, like that it's not always very obvious, but it certainly can be if you start realizing that there's always a sort of power dynamic, a force dynamic, a violence dynamic, that's in play. Um, let's see here. Let's go to page 173. If you drop down to that bottom paragraph, she says, I'll start at the middle. The Iliad formulated the principle long before the Gospels. She's talking about the New Testament Gospels did, and in almost the same terms. And then the quote: "Ares is just and kills those who kill." And she writes, "Perhaps all men, by the very act of being born, are destined to suffer violence." Seems about right. Yet this is a truth to which circumstance shuts men's eyes. The strong are, as a matter of fact, never absolutely strong, nor are the weak absolutely weak, but neither is aware of this. They have in common a refusal to believe that they both belong to the same species. The weak see no relation between themselves and the strong, and vice versa. So it's really important for her to emphasize that we are connected wherever we're at, and along this spectrum, or in this hierarchy, if you want to think about it in those terms, that the weak and the strong, both are joined by the fact that they are not absolutely to be understood. Their identity is not to be solely understood in terms of that positionality or that relation to the other. So the weak aren't absolutely weak in the way that the strong are absolutely strong, and vice versa. That the strong aren't as strong as they think that they are, and that the weak aren't as weak as they think that they are. That both have also the capacity to adopt something or demonstrate something of the other. And it's not just a choice. I think it's also just sort of the status of being a human, and not sort of having a fixed essence or a fixed identity. That we are, we're complex bundles of relations with all sorts of things going on within us and about us, and around us, and that the people that are strong aren't always going to be strong, and not in every instance, and so too with the weak. So again, we're trying to find a shared human identity when we're thinking about force. She says here, the man who is the possessor of force seems to walk through a non-resistant element in the human substance that surrounds him. Nothing has the power to interpose between the impulse and the act, the tiny interval that is reflection. She says here, where there is no room for reflection, there is none either for justice or prudence. That the powerful seem to think as though they can just act on their impulses. They can just do what they want. And again, this goes back to that ancient conversation in which Thrasymachus is putting forward, and then Nietzsche puts his own variation of it forward in the 19th century, and that is that they don't have to reflect. They just have to act, and if they've got the power to bring about their intentions, then it's justified. And she's saying that's just not really the case. That you need to be able, whether you find yourself as the one who has the various tools, placements, privilege, inner resources at your disposal, talents at your disposal, to be an actor of force, to be the sort of quote unquote primary figure in a power dynamic. You still need to be able to pause, to reflect, to think about what you're doing, right? Otherwise, you are just like the thing that you're rendering the other, the objects of your aggression, your plan, your control, your manipulations. It's having the same spiritual consequences upon you. Otherwise, there's just no possibility of justice. There's no possibility of wisdom. We could extend this to say there's no possibility of a good life. She says this again at the end of that paragraph on page 174. in the middle of the page, she says, "Thus it happens that those who have force on loan from fate count it on it too much and are destroyed." Um, it's not as though you're born into the world and that you made all of these like moves that solidified this place. Now, it's not to remove all human agency. You certainly do make choices. You certainly do choose to act on particular gifts or privileges given to you by circumstance. But that it's more a matter of fate in terms of what is sort of given to you, what it is that you are starting off with, right? What you have to work with, and then also how it plays out, because in a world populated with other people and traditions and just things that are happening, it may not be the case that you come into force as something that you seem to be directing. That it's basically just on loan for a little while. But people that have it don't see it that way, at least generally speaking. Um, and so perhaps folks need to that are exercising this through the accumulation and the use of wealth or political power, whatever it is, social influence. These people need to recognize that this is something that is not a denial of their hard work, but that it is more contingent upon, quote unquote, fate, um, circumstances beyond one's control than it is their agency, and perhaps act accordingly, perhaps act with a level of circumspectness, a level of circumspection, a level of I'll say humility, but again, that's a bit difficult for a lot of people that are in places of power and privilege. Um, she talks about it in the next paragraph, something that we mentioned before: the interval of hesitation, the pause, not just acting, not just reacting, but of creating the sort of space to let reason, to let virtue, sort of creating some space for it to sort of be visible or to come forward in terms of more of a response and more of a refusal to participate overtly. Violence done to me, I respond in violence. It could, again, verbally, physically, um, plans and plots, whatever it might be. And so on page 175, that top paragraph, which is the sort of last of that section, she says, in the middle of that paragraph, she says, in Oriental countries which are steeped in Buddhism, it is perhaps this Greek idea that is lived on under the name of karma. The Occident, the West, however, has lost it and no longer even has a word to express it in any of its languages. Conceptions of limit, measure, equilibrium, which ought to determine the conduct of life, are in the West restricted to a servile function in the vocabulary of technics. We are only geometricians of matter. The Greeks were, first of all, geometricians in the apprenticeship to virtue. I mean, she's saying something like, and this is going to go into the next reading with Heidegger and the question concerning technology, that what this has become are it's a sort of intellectual endeavor. It's also institutional. It's also structural. It's a societal phenomenon in which we are given over to the furtherance of technology and a technological way of life, and that this seems to be the only way that we know how to deal with anything. You get sick. What's the latest drug that's gonna fix it? Oh, you've got a problem. Well, let's think technologically about how to solve this, and not in terms of a a a broader sense of the Greek sense of techne or technique, as something that humans can formulate and act on, but we mean it largely in terms of some sort of tool, instrumentation, system that is going to somehow be the thing be the process by which it's solved. So we don't have to develop any techniques, any sort of inner resources, any sort of social resources that allow us to address the violence, to address the inequality, to address the unfreedom, to address the pessimism, whatever it is. It's just, oh, you're sad. Well, take this pill, try to relax and watch some more shows, do something that's fun, and it's not really allowing us or encouraging us to take these classical ideas of thought, of reflection, of good living, so if you will, and or perhaps like Heidegger's going to talk about, perhaps reconsider the role of art in your life, of poetic creation in your life, either as one who does it or one that sees it and thinks and reflects upon it. That perhaps that's a way forward. And she says here that here the apprenticeship to virtue, like maybe that's something that we should strongly reconsider, as how to make our way through this world of force, especially when it confronts us. Again, wherever you are, as the one who seems to be the enactor of it, perhaps because of the choices that you've made and your own ambitions and life aspirations, or just because it just happens to be a scenario in which you find yourself in that, or if you're on the other end of that spectrum, that virtue is something that is needed, and we have to learn how to pause and reflect if it's going to have a chance of coming forward into the situation. If it's, and again, that doesn't mean it's going to fix everything. It doesn't mean that all violence goes away. It doesn't mean that all domination goes away. But it's a more genuine, real, non-illusory response than just embracing the technological solution, or the complete resignation, or active participation in it, and trying to accumulate as much power and force to sort of dominate your way and manipulate your way through the world. Now, if you will, let's see. All right, let's just try to get to a couple more of these. So we've talked about some of the stuff over the next few pages. There's this really interesting, some lines from Achilles, in which someone's begging for their life. And then on 184, this is his response. He says, "Come, friend, you too must die. Why make a fuss about it? Patroclus, he too has died, a far better man than you are. Don't you see how handsome I am, how mighty? A noble father begat me, and I have a goddess for mother. Yet even I, like you, must some day encounter my fate, whether the hour strikes at noon or evening or sunrise, the hour that comes when some arms-bearing warrior will kill me." Achilles seems to recognize that while he's in this position, it's just temporary. It's circumstance. It's going to happen to him. She writes, to respect life in somebody else when you have had to castrate yourself of all yearning for it demands a truly heartbreaking exertion of the powers of generosity. It's impossible to imagine any of Homer's warriors being capable of such an exertion unless it is that warrior who dwells in a peculiar way at the very center of the poem. I mean Patroclus. And again, if you're familiar with the poem, this might be more meaningful to you. Who, quote, knew how to be sweet to everybody, and who throughout the Iliad commits no cruel or brutal act. And then we drop down and says, possessed by war, he, like the slave, becomes a thing, though his manner of doing so is different over him too. Words are as powerless as over matter itself. And both, at the touch of force, experience its inevitable effects. They become deaf and dumb. And so again, people being rendered as things, people becoming, blind, deaf, dumb, that there seems to be the rare figure who is able to, in a sense, rise above it. But they are rare. It is miraculous. Going back to some of those comments about love, that to be able to see the other, that is the aggressor in the equation, um, as someone who can still be a sort of, while in many ways taboo, strange, and impossible object of love, it seems as though they become the necessary object of love. In some because of circumstances, but also because perhaps that's what's needed to somehow offset this formula of force. So let's see. Um, she talks about on page 185 how this miracle, this transformation, the transforming of the possibilities of these situations, of our imagination to perhaps see these responses as ways forward. These are rare miracles of a brief duration. So again, we're not transforming society. Like we can't we can't form the political party that enacts this. There's no legislation for this. But this is sort of each individual subject person cultivating this within their life. Now, societally, right? We can obviously be members of organizations or groups or family units or whatever that encourage this, that promote this, that make it perhaps something that's not quite so strange in our own lives, but that ultimately it's something that like we have to undertake to do. Let's see. On page 187, past the middle part of the page, she says, "The most beautiful friendship of all, the friendship between comrades at arms, is the final theme of the epic." And then she quotes from the Iliad, "But Achilles wept, dreaming of the beloved comrade, sleep, all prevailing, would not take him. He turned over again and again." And then she writes, "But the purest triumph of love, the crowning grace of war, is the friendship that floods the hearts of mortal enemies." Right? This is the rare moment of grace in which people that are at odds, trying to kill one another, can actually come to love one another. And this is summed up again in that tragic account, which she names a tragic account. One of the aspects of the Gospels, is that teaching, to love your enemies, right? And it's such an impossibility, and it's something that Nietzsche would have a lot of problem with, I think, in a certain sense. He does talk about a way of reconsidering our enemies, and his star friendship aphorism, um, in the Gay Science, which I think it might be aphorism 190, but I have to double check. In any case, you know, the idea here is that two people can come to recognize that they are caught up in force and that they don't have to render the other person as a thing. Now, how it plays out, who knows? I mean, perhaps they're still forced to, fight and kill one another, but that they don't have to render one another things in a spiritual sense. Now, I do think that she hopes for the end of possibility of violence, and that it could ultimately express itself in an interaction in which violence wasn't done that as well. But again, I don't think that she's aspiring to some grand, social program in which war ends and there's no more conflict. I don't think she has that level of idealism. Um, anyways, love hearing this. Let's see. On page 191, at the beginning of that next section, she says, "In any case, this poem is a miracle." The Iliad. "Its bitterness is the only justifiable bitterness, for it springs from the subjection of the human spirit to force, that is, in the last analysis, to matter. This subjection is the common lot, although each spirit will bear it differently in proportion to its own virtue. No one in the Iliad is spared by it, and no one on earth is. No one who succumbs to it by virtue of this fact regarded with contempt. Whoever, within his own soul and in human relations, escapes the dominion of force is loved, but loved sorrowfully because of the threat of destruction that constantly hangs over them. That this is the tragic condition in life, that it's any escape is temporary, and even the one who does find a way out in any scenario, it's it's bittersweet because we know that it's still a possibility and a likelihood that they're still going to be subject to force at some point in time. And again, these are varying degrees of of of, of, it, of being explicit or obvious. It's not always being killed and turned into a corpse. It's what the effects that this sort of subordination to force has on us psychically, on the psyche, on the soul, and to which we are in the 21st century. This is people who are just rendered into workers and consumers, and that there's maybe not always a face of an oppressor. I mean, there could be, but it's that we're dealing with institutions that don't really care about us as people or about our mental life or our spiritual life, and they really don't care about a virtuous life or a life lived well. That it's what it demands of you, what it allows you to do, and how much time do you need to just sort of like chill out and not think about what's going on in the world or in your own life, right? This is another sort of iteration of this epic or this poem of force that we really probably need to start seriously considering um, a better way forward for ourselves personally. Societally, again, that's a whole other problem to tackle. And some of the radical philosophies of the 19th and 20th century, you know, do address it. Um, Marx, for example, and critical theory in the 20th century. Um, but you know, our appetites for those things are conditioned, of course, by our circumstances and what we're used to, and what we take to be our, cultural ethos. And so, perhaps some of those more radical social and political philosophies are not things that we can take seriously, and perhaps they don't work. But what we can do, regardless of our feelings about those things and our thoughts about those things, and what our analysis is, we can deal with our own life, our own mental life, our own spiritual life, in terms of how to not be rendered as things, not to be rendered as what Heidegger would call standing reserve, um, you know, not to be rendered just as resources ourselves to be managed, to be controlled, to be used. Um, Finally, I just want to take a look at um, page 193. A few lines down from the top, she says, "Moreover, nothing is so rare as to see misfortune fairly portrayed. The tendency is either to treat the unfortunate person as though catastrophe were his natural vocation, or to ignore the effects of misfortune on the soul, to assume that the soul can suffer and remain unmarked by it, can fail in fact to be recast in misfortune's image. The Greeks, generally speaking, were endowed with spiritual force that allowed them to avoid self-deception. They could be more honest with themselves about the world, the way it worked, about who they were, about their significance. The rewards of this were great. They discovered how to achieve in all their acts the greatest lucidity, purity, and simplicity. But the spirit that was transmitted from the Iliad to the Gospels, by way of the tragic poets, never jumped the borders of Greek civilization. Once Greece was destroyed, nothing remained of the spirit but pale reflections." I mean, she's basically saying that for the most part, we've lost it. We've lost this as a culturally present, artifactually significant, um, you know, I'll say solution. It's not in the strict sense of solution, but that the Greeks' honesty and the and the virtuous sort of undertakings, thought life, ethical life that they generated in response. So like devastating and true depictions of how the world works, and then what we have to do to deal with it. That we've lost that. That our psychology, our sociology, our entertainments, all of these facets of sort of modern life, they do not provide us with the same picture of reality and then how to like deal with that reality. And we're left with pale imitations. We're left with tropes. We're left with, you know, things that amuse without enlightening. Um, and this is a bit, I think she's trying to, provoke us to reconsider our approach to how we tend to our inner life, and to the various things that we have been given. Like, you know, does anyone read the Iliad? Does anyone read the Gospels? And again, for what she's here trying to get at, what she's trying to, push us to see and perhaps do in response. Um, Not push in a force way, I don't think. But anyways, hopefully that gives you a good sense of what's going on in this work and has given you some things to think about. And I think pulls from some of the things that was going on in Nietzsche and is anticipating some of the stuff that's going to be going on in Heidegger, which we'll come back and start doing that next week. So until then, keep reading, keep thinking, and I'll see you soon.